let's dive straight into the heart of German idealism, but with a twist. We're not just looking at the grand narrative Hegel painted for himself, that neat linear progression from Kant to his own system. Instead, we're exploring the undercurrents, the realist whispers and shouts that ran through Fichte, Schelling, and Schopenhauer. Think of it as the philosophical equivalent of finding hidden tracks in a well-trodden path. So, the classic story, largely shaped by Hegel himself and echoed by folks like Kroner, is this. Kant kicks things off, Fichte and Schelling take the baton, and then Hegel hits the home run with his universal synthesis. It's tidy, it's linear, it's got a clear endpoint. But hold on, that's not the whole picture, is it? Over the years, scholars have been digging deeper, and what they found is fascinating. Suddenly, Schelling isn't just a stepping stone for Hegel. He's seen as reaching deeper insights. Fichte's later work gets a second look. And Schopenhauer? Once kicked out of the idealist club, now he's back in, recognized as having built his complete system before Hegel even finished writing his. Why does this matter? Because it shows the original story was incomplete, maybe even biased. It wasn't just Hegel's perspective, there were other powerful voices pushing against the purely rational synthesis. Where Hegel saw the world as ultimately rational, reason ruling supreme, everything fitting neatly under the umbrella of the universal, mind or spirit being the absolute certainty, and all conflicts eventually reconciled. Fichte, Schelling, and Schopenhauer were like, hold on a minute. They pushed back against this picture where reason is always just dealing with itself. Their big idea: there's more to reality than reason can capture. The absolute isn't just about the mind's self-knowledge. There's something else going on. Strife, struggle, resistance, these things aren't just temporary hiccups waiting for reason to fix them. They might be fundamental aspects of existence. These three thinkers were essentially saying, let's not forget the parts of life and the world that don't fit neatly into our neat little rational boxes. Think of Kant as setting the stage, figuring out what reason can do and where its boundaries lie. Fichte, Schelling, and Schopenhauer picked up this baton, but ran in a slightly different direction. They tried to keep the balance Kant started. Yes, the world reflects reason's interests, that's the idealist part. But no, the world isn't just made of reason, that's the realist part. They doubled down on that realist side. Remember those critics Kant had, Hamann, Herder, Jacobi? They were already saying, reason isn't all-powerful, it doesn't make everything. Well, Fichte, Schelling, and Schopenhauer took that critique seriously and ran with it, building a kind of realist add-on to the idealist structure. It's like taking a beautiful, intricate clockwork model, idealism, and realizing you need to add some unpredictable, messy gears, reality beyond reason, to make it work properly. And here's a kicker: because these guys were already doing this deep dive into the limits of reason from within the idealist tradition, it kind of makes those trendy postmodern critiques of modern philosophy look a bit, well, less revolutionary. Because the radical questioning, the self-limitation of reason, was already happening back then. It wasn't some brand new invention. Plus, Fichte, Schelling, and Schopenhauer weren't just throwing out ideas willy-nilly. They were serious, persistent about this critique. Compare that to some later thinkers who seemed to just pick and choose bits of idealism they liked. No, these three were systematically rethinking fundamental things: nature, the body, the will, feelings, treating them not as secondary to reason, but as primary forces. It wasn't about ditching idealism entirely, but about fixing it, adding a crucial piece, acknowledging a reality beyond reason that's actually necessary for reason to exist at all. So, what did this realist supplementation achieve? It gave future philosophers a whole arsenal of concepts and arguments to use when they eventually went after Hegel's grand system. Thinkers like Kierkegaard, Feuerbach, and Marx, they weren't just pulling ideas out of thin air. They were drawing on the groundwork laid by Fichte, Schelling, and Schopenhauer. Sometimes, interestingly, the critique of Hegel's style of idealism happened even before Hegel fully developed his ideas or published them. It's like Fichte, Schelling, and Schopenhauer were unknowingly preparing the intellectual ammunition for the battles that would come later. For the rest of our discussion, we'll zoom in on each of these three, looking specifically at how they navigated the tension between the real and the ideal, the rational and the irrational, the thinking and the feeling parts of the self. Alright, let's start with Fichte. At first glance, he looks like the poster child for subjective idealism, right? He throws out Kant's things in themselves and puts this absolute I on the throne as the source of everything. Sounds pretty idealistic, maybe even a bit solipsistic. But hold on, there's a catch. Fichte's I isn't quite as absolute as it seems. First off, the subject at the center isn't some abstract infinite entity, it's the finite human being. The absolute I is more like the underlying condition or form of our finite experience, not the boss calling all the shots. Fichte talks about self-constitution genesis but also facticity, the brute givenness of our situation. It's like saying, sure, we build our understanding, but we also find ourselves thrown into a world that has rules we didn't create. As Fichte's thought evolved, he seemed to increasingly separate the I from the absolute, hinting that the I isn't the master of its own house. It's pointing towards something deeper, something beyond just the I's self-positing activity. Fichte called his main project a pragmatic history of the human mind. The star of this show is the I, or reason. Now Fichte saw two sides to this I, the theoretical one, which is about knowing, and the practical one, about willing or acting. Think of them as two faces of the same rational coin. The absolute I is the origin story, the mythical point where everything was just I, and also the ultimate goal, where all distinctions fade away. But real life happens in between. Here's the crucial bit for the theoretical I. To know anything, the I has to posit something outside itself, the not I. But this not I isn't just sitting there waiting to be discovered. The I creates it. Why? Because the I bumps up against a limit, a check. Its outward push gets blocked, forcing it to turn inward. This resistance, this anstoss, is what makes the apposit the not I as the realm of objects. It's like trying to push a wall, the wall resists, and in that resistance, you become aware of the wall and your own pushing action. Now flip the coin to the practical I. This I is doing stuff, trying to change things, specifically feelings or sensations. What checks the practical I, feeling itself? When you try to act, you feel resistance or confirmation through your sensory experience. The goal here is similar to the theoretical side. Minimize the influence of the not I, now manifest as feeling, by asserting the I's will. You want to replace feelings dictated by external factors with feelings you've willed into existence through your actions. Think of it as trying to sculpt your emotional landscape. But again, this is an ideal. Perfectly controlling your feelings through sheer will. Uneachable yet constantly pursued. The key takeaway is that whether you're thinking or acting, the I is always bumping up against these limits, this check or feeling. Consciousness itself relies on this ongoing interplay with something outside the I's direct control. You can't have a conscious subject without an object world to interact with, even if that world is partly constructed by the I. This idea that the I depends on something beyond itself becomes a bigger theme in Fichte's later work. He's wrestling with two truths. One, everything real for us must be somehow brought into existence by our I. Two, there are undeniable constraints on what our I can do, suggesting something real exists prior to and independent of the I. How do you even think about something that precedes thought? It's tricky. Fichte's early attempts to grasp this absolute often landed him in religious language. Drawing on Kant's moral philosophy, he linked the absolute directly to the moral order of the world. Think of it as the universe striving towards a perfectly moral state. He used terms like holy or infinite will, tapping into the I's practical volitional nature. But even here, the absolute remains tied to the I's perspective, specifically the I's moral certainty. Belief in God becomes belief in one's own moral duty. And the absolute only makes sense from the viewpoint of finite beings needing coordination. Fichte's thinking evolved further. He started seeing the I not as the foundation, but as the appearance of the absolute. The I is the form, the way the absolute shows up for us. So the big question shifts. How does knowledge relate to this absolute ground? Fichte uses the image metaphor. Knowledge is like an image of the absolute. It's not the absolute itself, so it's inferior, but it has the power to shape and create images. Crucially, what gets imaged isn't some pre-existing thing out there. Nothing has being independent of the absolute and its appearance as knowledge. It's all part of the same package deal. The appearance is the appearance. There's nothing behind it that isn't already part of the absolute reality being appeared. Fichte looked at this I/absolute relationship from two angles. First, ascent, trying to get from our limited I or knowledge up to the absolute. This requires a kind of self-annihilation of thought, because how can finite thought grasp the unthinkable? Thinking has to unthink itself to approach the absolute. Second, descent, the absolute showing up as the I or knowledge. Here, the absolute isn't hidden behind the I. It is the I manifesting itself through thinking and willing. This led Fichte to tweak his famous phrases. Instead of just I think, he'd say knowledge thinks. It's like shifting from I am driving to the car is driving. Similarly, he suggested the will wills. This doesn't mean the I or the will disappears. It means they are vehicles for something deeper. The absolute works through the I, preventing a complete split. So, Fichte's system stays balanced. It's real idealism. The I points to a real absolute, and ideal realism. Any thought of that absolute is still the I's thought. Moving on to Schelling. Like Fichte, he wrestled with the tension between freedom and the constraints of facticity on one hand, and the desire for a total system on the other. But Schelling decided philosophy shouldn't start from the limitations of the human mind like Kant and Fichte did. No, he wanted to start with the absolute itself. This was a big departure. It reminds me a bit of Spinoza, who started with God or nature as the absolute substance, and then derived everything else. Schelling liked the pantheistic idea. God is reality, but he couldn't stomach Spinoza's deterministic view where everything is just mechanical cause and effect with no real freedom. So, Schelling tried to blend the best of both worlds, a metaphysics starting from the absolute, like Spinoza, but keeping the Kantian and Fichtean emphasis on freedom, both for humans and for God. His main playgrounds became the relationship between the finite and the infinite, and between mind, spirit, and nature. In his early days, hanging out with Fichte, Schelling seemed to echo the idea of continuity between nature and mind. But even then, there was a subtle difference. For Schelling, the I wasn't just a transcendental structure of consciousness, it felt more real, more like the undifferentiated divine source of everything. This led him to rethink the whole dogmatism versus criticism debate. Kant and Fichte dismissed dogmatism as naive realism. Schelling said, hold on, maybe both are valid starting points, just different paths. Neither could truly know the absolute through pure reason. Both needed a practical approach. This set the stage for his nature philosophy, or philosophy of nature. This was his direct challenge to Kant and Fichte. Instead of deriving nature from mind, let's derive mind from nature. He envisioned nature as this self-organizing, organic force. Mind isn't a sudden jump, but nature waking up, emerging from an unconscious state. He even called this shared essence Geist, or spirit. Schelling then tried to unify these ideas with his identity philosophy. The big idea here is that nature and mind, the real and the ideal, aren't fundamentally different. They spring from the same absolute source. Think of the absolute as a point of pure indifference, neither real nor ideal, but capable of becoming both. The development from nature to mind, or real to ideal, is just the absolute splitting itself into finite and infinite aspects, and then bringing them back together in the higher form of mind or spirit. It's a neat symmetry, but Schelling himself felt uneasy. If the absolute is completely undifferentiated, how does anything come out of it? How does the world emerge? It's like asking how a seed contains a tree. It seems possible, but the mechanism is obscure. This led Schelling to a darker, more complex picture of the absolute. To explain how evil or difference could arise in a supposedly perfect world, he had to say the absolute itself wasn't perfectly simple. He introduced a distinction between a being's ground or nature and its existence. Think of God's ground as a kind of dark, chaotic will, a primordial urge that hasn't yet grasped reason. God's existence is the process of bringing light and order to this darkness. The original act of God was transforming this dark unity into a distinct, articulated image or idea. It was like imposing structure onto chaos. This internal tension between the dark, unformed will and the enlightening reason became central. This duality wasn't just for God. Schelling argued it permeates creation. Humans embody this tension too, the particular will clashing with the universal will. Evil happens when the particular wins. But humans also share in the light, making moral choices possible. Later in his life, Schelling shifted again, adding a personal historical dimension to God, a God who becomes or reveals himself over time. This further complicated things because a personal God interacting in history introduces unpredictability, something reason struggles with. So, Schelling distinguished between negative philosophy, which sticks to reason, and positive philosophy, which deals with supersensory data accessible through religion or myth. His point was stark. True reality, being, goes beyond what reason can handle. Reason can only build possibilities. Reality provides the actual fact. Now for Schopenhauer. His starting point echoes the others. Reality isn't just rational. But for him, the irrational core is the will. This isn't just practical reason. It's a blind, striving force, the true thing in itself. He takes Kant's transcendental approach and widens it. Kant focused on cognition. Schopenhauer adds the affective dimension, the drive, the urge, the will. This will isn't reason's servant, it's the boss, maybe even the true self. And this isn't just about us. Schopenhauer argues this will is the fundamental character of the entire universe. Everything's driven by this relentless striving, this constant push and pull between satisfaction and dissatisfaction. Life at its core is will to power writ large. Schopenhauer tells a story about this will. Originally, intellect was just a tool of the will. But sometimes, especially in art, intellect can break free. Asceticism is the ultimate escape. But ultimately, it's the will itself, through its intellectual expressions, that comes to recognize its own nature, that it's just blind striving, and then turns against itself. The punchline? The world is the will's self-knowledge. What began as a revelation process ends in disillusionment. Before getting to this dark secret, though, Schopenhauer lays down a familiar Kantian foundation, the world as representation. Just like Kant, he says our experienced world depends on our cognitive faculties. The master rule here is the principle of sufficient reason. Nothing happens without a reason. This principle governs how we understand everything, from physical causality to logic. Schopenhauer breaks down this principle of sufficient reason into four types, a fourfold root. First, the causal reason for becoming, governing physical objects. Second, the mathematical reason for being, for numbers and space. Third, the logical reason for knowing, for concepts. Fourth, the psychological reason for doing, linking mental states to actions. These are the four ways our intellect imposes order using the PSR. But here's the twist. The intellect itself, the subject that applies the PSR, isn't subject to the PSR. It's the ungrounded foundation upon which all grounded relations are built. It's like the rule maker who isn't bound by the rules they make. And importantly, the relationship between the knowing subject and the world is reciprocal. Neither can exist without the other. Now, what about the will, the thing behind the representation? Schopenhauer insists it's fundamentally different from the intellect governed by the PSR. The will itself is groundless, and it doesn't provide the ground for anything else either. There's no reason why the will exists, or why it does what it does. Reason only kicks in within the world of representations, thanks to the intellect. The will's connection to the intellect is indirect. The will manifests as intellect, but you can't trace a neat causal line from the will to any specific object of thought. Schopenhauer calls these manifestations of the will its objectivity, like Plato's forms, underlying appearances but not causing them. To truly grasp this will, you need a special kind of subject, the pure subject of cognition, achieved through intense aesthetic experience, where you lose yourself in an ideal object. Interestingly, both the will and this pure intellect are beyond the PSR, the final destination of this process. A will-less intellect that negates everything, including itself, leaving only nothing. Schopenhauer also contrasts the subject of knowing with the subject of willing. We have a dual perspective on ourselves. Cognitively, the knowing self immediately knows itself as the willing self. They are identical, and we know this identity immediately. But Schopenhauer admits he can't explain this. He calls it the miracle par excellence, the world not. It's like the ultimate mystery of self-awareness. On the cognitive side, the willing self experiences its body not as inert matter, but as animated body, inseparable from the will. The act of willing and the physical action are identical, just expressed differently. Will is always embodied. This human identity mirrors the cosmic one. The will is the world. Negate the will, and you negate the world, leaving only nothing. So what ties Fichte, Schelling, and Schopenhauer together? That persistent feeling that reality isn't just rational, that it exceeds reason's grasp. They all point to something else. Something they often call the will, especially its freedom from rational control. This will isn't just practical reason, it's a self-determining force shaping reality. At the human level, this means we're not just determined puppets of reason or nature. We have freedom, albeit a strange kind, to shape our inner selves, our intelligible character. We become who we are through a kind of self-creation, a transcendental self-genesis. This idea that existence comes first, and essence is something we forge ourselves, became hugely influential, feeding directly into existential thinkers like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. It's a legacy of radical freedom lurking within the heart of German idealism.